Hello, fans, collectors, and investors. Welcome back to Iconic Baseball. I'm Iconic Al, and today we are back with another countdown video. If you are into collecting the all-time greats and the most iconic ball players in baseball history, this is your channel. I highly recommend you subscribe. Today we are on number 78 on my top 100 countdown, and it is a very special player, and a player that elicits emotion from fans and from collectors. And it's because his story is a story of injustice. It's a story of greatness, and it's a story of tragedy. And I think there's a human element, there's a human connection that people make with players like that. This is a guy who started his career late because of segregation. There was segregation in the game, and he played in the Negro Leagues and the Mexican Leagues for many years. In fact, 9 years before he was even able to play in the major leagues. In his major league career, he was able to establish that he was one of the great catchers in baseball history, and won 3 MVP awards in his brief time in Major League Baseball. And then his career was tragically cut short by a motor vehicle accident, which actually rendered him paralyzed. So his story is a complex one, but in the time he was in the game, he was able to establish himself as one of the great catchers in baseball history, won a ring with the iconic 1955 Brooklyn Dodgers, and to this day is one of the more beloved players in baseball history. I'm talking about the great Roy Campanella.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and cracker jack. I don't care if I never get back. Let me root for the home team. If they don't win, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out at the old ball game.
Ultimately, I want my collection to be representative of history, and in a proportionate way represent the significant players of each era and of each position who was significant. For the sake of this video, let's look at catchers. The 20s and 30s, that was Mickey Cochran. He was the dominant catcher of 20s and 30s. And there's overlap here. 30s and 40s, you could argue Josh Gibson was probably the most dominant catcher of those years, although not a major league catcher, unfortunately. Josh Gibson maybe was the greatest catcher of all time. Very hard to know because of a lack of good stats to compare, but of all the anecdotes we've heard, Josh Gibson was probably one of the top 3 catchers of all time. The 40s and 50s, that brings us to Roy Campanella. He was the premier catcher of those years. Some of them in the Negro Leagues and the Mexican Leagues, and some of them, thankfully, in the major leagues. Well, just for completeness here, 50s and 60s, I give that to Yogi Berra. I think Yogi Berra was probably the dominant catcher, the most iconic catcher of the 50s and 60s. Moving on to the 70s and 80s, Johnny Bench. Johnny Bench, arguably the greatest catcher of all time, ruled the 70s and 80s and probably overshadowed guys like Gary Carter and Carlton Fisk. And then of the more modern era, 1990s and 2000s, Pudge Rodriguez and Mike Piazza. I would say they're probably the more dominant, iconic catchers of, let's say, my childhood, 90s and 2000s. But working back, you can say that Roy Campanella was the premier, the dominant catcher of the 40s and 50s. And his numbers bear that out. For 10 years. Now, his major league career was 10 years, largely because he had to spend the first 9 years or so playing in the Negro Leagues and the Mexican Leagues. And so we really don't have great stats from those years, but we know enough. Based on his major league years, he hit .276 and was a 3-time MVP award winner. And that is almost secondary to how great he was as a catcher. Let me just lay this out for you. His career, 57% of base stealers thrown out is number 1 all time. No one has ever thrown out 57% of base stealers. I mean, that's just a striking number. 40% is a great number. 57% it's unfair. There's a great quote about Roy Campanella in a book I read recently. He's described as A defensive marvel with an arm that defied description. Could you imagine standing on the same field, watching Roy Campanella gun down a player? I mean, his arm defied description. I wish they had a clock on his arm. I wonder how fast he was throwing down to second base. But we'll just have to guess. We'll just have to guess that he had a cannon. Other numbers you can look at, I mean, he walked more than he struck out, which is something that's, again, very rare among sluggers, among high-level hitters. He walked 533 times, struck out 501 times. He walked more than he struck out, which is just, I always find that very impressive. Maybe that's just because of the game that we see today, but more walks than strikeouts always just extra points, in my opinion. But his iconic status, the emotion that he elicits among fans, it's never going away. Especially after winning that 1955 championship with the Dodgers, with Jackie Robinson and Gil Hodges. Just such a Pee Wee Reese, such an iconic team, such an iconic win. Now this is my one and only Roy Campanella card. This is the 54 Bowman, 1 year before they won the championship. And how can you not get a little emotional looking at that portrait? Beautiful shot of Roy Campanella. It's a really clean card. It's actually a card I've had in my collection for over 20 years. One of the original vintage cards that I was able to acquire back in probably my middle school, high school years. Just a beautiful, it's a PSA 4. Actually got this graded recently. It's in a recent reveal that I did, actually. And it's just a beautiful card. I don't think I'll ever need another Roy Campanella card, to be honest. I'd love to add a Roy Campanella autograph someday. They are not cheap due to his accident, which actually left him paralyzed. And then I believe he suffered a stroke later in life, which did affect his ability to sign pieces. So there are not many, it's rare to find a nice Roy Campanella autograph from earlier in his career. Someday, if the budget allows, I'd love to add one. But I'm sure those of you who know the market know that those aren't cheap. So for now, I'm just going to stick with that autograph right there, which is a replica, reproduction autograph. 1954 Bowman, Roy Campanella. Thank you for joining me on this video, and remember to follow the channel, subscribe, and until next time, keep collecting and stay iconic.